Israel is clearly ramping up demolitions. According to Haaretz report, 293 homes have been demolished in just 6 weeks this year, compared with 447 for 2015. Shai.
Right. Yeah, that statistic refers also to homes being demolished for illegal building permits and that kind of thing. But when you talk about the homes being demolished in a security context because of terrorist acts, we're still talking about a fairly considerable number, well over a dozen just in the current context of the current terror wave. It's being used, I would say, past a certain level of extremity. When you talk about the offenses themselves, the attacks, it's become quite expected, you could say. We've seen an overall reduction in the amount of violence since about March, April, but there have been a number of measures. It's difficult to ascribe them to particularly this tactic or measure. When we spoke to IDF officers, they also admitted they don't actually have any data or numbers, statistics that can actually point to this measure being overall effective. They can point to a few cases where they know that the threat of demolition has led to, for example, family members being turned in. But they can also point to cases where it's thought to have inspired later attacks, and it's also known that terror groups usually fund the rebuilding of the homes. So there's a whole debate here, and I wouldn't say that there is any really classic sort of indication that this is effective.
I mean, what's your take?
It's very controversial, even within the defense establishment, for the very reason which I mentioned, because there's a delicate balance when a suicide bomber, a person who decided that his own life was worth sacrificing, when he goes out on a mission, does he really care what happens to his family, to their house? Perhaps some of them do, and perhaps some of these actions are foiled either by the perpetrators themselves, who stop short of acting, or their families turning them in. But in other cases, of course, other people would take revenge for this act, and there will be bitterness all around. Had it been left only to the generals and to the coordinator in the territories and the Shin Bet Internal Security Agency, they would have probably voted against it, all in all, with some exceptions. But because politicians are, of course, looking towards public opinion, and they believe that they must do something, sometimes anything, to show that they are not sitting idly by, you are going to see such demolitions in the near future, too.
And do you believe this could be attributed to the new foreign minister, the new administration?
The new foreign minister?
Defense minister.
I mean, right. Defense minister. We don't have a foreign minister yet.
Right. No, I wouldn't say so. Actually, the rate of the use of this tactic was in place already under the former defense minister. And when we also spoke to defense ministry representatives during his term, they also stated the fact that they know, that's how they phrased it to me, that they know that this measure achieves deterrence, but they also admitted that they didn't have actual statistics, like the army, to actually prove that.
There's a strange symmetry here. They kill real people, we kill real estate. Doesn't seem right.
And what is, as far as the Palestinian reaction to this collective punishment that's become standard?
The Palestinians understand that the occupation authorities, such as they are, must do something, including closures. Immediately, right after such a horrendous act is performed, they understand it, they expect it, and for the first couple of days, they take it passively. But as time goes by, if, for instance, there is a terror cell which is yet to be apprehended, and the closure goes on, it becomes counterproductive.
Absolutely. And as you both mentioned, it's a tool used as deterrence. Is there any reason to believe that it's an effective tool? Are there certain people within the administration or any proof that this tool is working long-term, short-term?
Again, it's complicated because they can definitely point to a few examples where it's known to have worked, but they can also point to examples where it's known to have not worked and even been counterproductive. So I'm saying that what we're missing here is an overall study or some sort of serious inquiry into the matter of exactly how effective it is. And I'm not saying this is easy. I'm not sure you can even prove that in a very effective way.
We are talking tactics here, and what Israel lacks is strategy. Had the Israeli government had a strategy in which it was willing to pursue peace for territory, and there would have been some political horizon in which the perpetrators are also severely punished, but alongside such punishment, there would have been rewards, not only retribution, but rewards. the Palestinian community would have understood, even when such measures were to have taken.
Sometimes the assailants, the terrorists, aren't actually alive after their own attack. In this case, they are and will be held for trial. I am wondering if, in your opinion, these measures that are being taken are more of an internal action to appease the Israeli public more than a tool to deter terror.
It seems so, because 10 or 12 years ago, at the height of the bus bombings, the suicide bombings, there was an internal Israeli Defense Forces panel chaired by a major general, which came down against such measures because it concluded that all in all it is detrimental to the Israeli interest, not because it had a lot of compassion for the Palestinians, because looking at it purely from the point of view of the Israeli interest, it concluded that it is better not to do it. And here we are, a decade later, and we have readopted this measure. It must have been because of domestic considerations.
And these voices that you're talking about aren't heard, and if they are, a lot of public opposition to this. Meanwhile, a special report from inside East Jerusalem, where Jewish activists are trying to change local demographics. In an already volatile neighborhood in the Holy City, a far-right group called Ateret Kohanim is working to move Israeli Jews into predominantly Muslim areas. Here's senior defense correspondent once again, Shai with a rare look into their activity, considered controversial by many.
The neighborhood of Silwan is located in East Jerusalem, just below the site known to Jews as the Temple Mount and to Muslims as the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound, or noble sanctuary. The vast majority of residents are Palestinian, but we came here to get a look at the latest project being run by Ateret Kohanim, a far-right group which seeks to move Jews into predominantly Muslim neighborhoods. Daniel Luria is Ateret Kohanim's spokesman, and he took us to see an old synagogue whose cornerstone was laid here in 1885.
And this is the synagogue itself.
It was built to serve a community of Yemenite Jews who had immigrated a few years earlier. The last Yemenite Jews moved out of the neighborhood in 1937 following riots. The synagogue has now been restored.
Here's one of the arches, the second arch over here. So the Mori was literally standing here where I am now.
It's a heartwarming story, but it's not the whole story. To restore the synagogue, several Palestinian families who were living here were evicted by force after a high court ruling a few months ago.
They were offered money even though they didn't need to be, because they were illegal squatters who had destroyed a synagogue and who had no rights here.
Ateret Kohanim have had their representatives elected to the board of the trust, or Hekdesh, which now owns the strip of land where the old Jewish neighborhood once stood. Since 2004, they have managed to move over 20 Jewish families into houses here, despite the tensions involved. Luria says that forced evictions, used in the case of the synagogue, are not the usual tactic.
God forbid, the word evict is something very foreign to Ateret Kohanim. First of all, is not focused on not courts, on not eviction.
While Luria denied an emphasis on legal proceedings, the local Palestinians say otherwise. Zuhair Rajbi, who lives next door to the old synagogue, told us of his conversations with an Ateret Kohanim representative whose identity is under a police gag order.
He said to me, "Listen, you're being sued. I want to present the writ to you by hand." I asked him, "What are you talking about?" He said, "The house you're living in is our house, on our land. I'm from Ateret Kohanim."
No Arab has ever been forced to sell. Do you think we could get away with putting a gun to someone's head and saying sell? That doesn't happen.
Rajbi told us that Ateret Kohanim routinely use their connections with local and governmental authorities to crank up the pressure.
He says to me, "Listen, I heard that in 2007 you were found guilty of fraud. That you have a record and that you were in jail." I said to him, "So what? What's your problem? I was convicted in many cases. Is this a threat? Are you trying to scare me or what?"
The Palestinians say that most of the families who have accepted money to leave have done so after being entangled in legal fees and proceedings.
An Arab sells, a Jew buys, and a Jew moves in. That's the whole story here. It's ideological real estate with a little bit of a volcanic political twinge.
Those Jews who decide to move in do so at great risk. One family's home was attacked 126 times over a period of 3 months.
they do their best to disconnect.
This is what we call the country club of the Yemenite village. We converted this protected backyard because there's no alleyway where they can't throw stones, no Molotov cocktails. The immediate neighbours can't get away with anything.
But security comes at a cost. Betty Hirschman is with i24news, a left-wing group which objects to Teret Kohanim's activity.
The Israeli government underwrites the private security of these settlers to the tune of tens, if not hundreds of millions of shekels that we taxpayers pay every year.
i24news also emphasizes that placing Jews in predominantly Muslim neighborhoods of Jerusalem complicates any prospective peace deal along the lines of the two-state solution. Teret Kohanim, for their part, do not hide their ideological and religious motives and intend on continuing their activity.
Shai, you spent the day in East Jerusalem, and as we saw in your report, the Palestinian residents seem very upset about these actions being taken by the Jewish activists. However, it is legal.
Right. The thing is, they are able, Teret Kohanim are able to produce the documents, not just them, that prove that this land, a strip of land in the Palestinian neighborhood today of Silwan, that there was an old Jewish Yemenite community back in the 1900s. I think there's little doubt about that, but the question is here, does a historic connection to a parcel of land actually justify the removal, the eviction in certain cases, of people who have lived there for generations? Maybe the original people could be considered squatters. Can the same be said after several generations further along the line? Of course, there is also a relevant comparison that you need to make. Many of the Palestinians who actually found themselves in Silwan eventually originally lived in western Jerusalem neighborhoods and were driven out more or less of their homes, left for one reason or another. They do not have any legal opportunity to claim property in western Jerusalem neighborhoods, even if they can prove that the property is theirs. So we're talking about
this claim would have to work both ways. Amir, what's your take?
Leaving aside the Yemenite angle, which is now one of the watchwords of Israeli politics, with the old problem of the possible abduction of Yemenite children being revisited, there are several issues here. First of all, when Israel took over these territories, both the West Bank and East Jerusalem, in 1967, it decided to freeze the situation as it was in 1948 during the war, when several Jewish settlements were taken over by the Kingdom of Jordan. However, it made exceptions for several of these settlements when the people who were at least the offspring of those who lived there in 1948 wanted to go back. So this was in the West Bank, in the Gush Etzion area, and also in East Jerusalem. Now, there was the old Jewish quarter, but there were also several separate Jewish neighborhoods in the other quarters. So the doctrine is, what's mine is mine, what's yours is also mine. And if it's not state-owned land, if it's private property, I can pay you, you will sell me the property, I will then have a foothold there, and the state will have to guard me, as Ms. Hirschman said, and this puts a private business into a public perspective.
Exactly. And as you mentioned, the security of these mini neighborhoods, not even mini neighborhoods, are they actually the state's responsibility?
Well, legally, the state is perhaps committed to provide security. We're talking about a lot of money. We're talking about private security guards who are, at the end of the day, funded by the state. This is 24/7 security around each location. You're talking about 6 or 7 homes, I believe, in this strip of land, over 20 families. There are questions over a number of elements, let's call it, of government involvement in this whole issue. There's overt and covert support. There's the questions over why exactly members of Teret Kohanim, who are known to be a radical right-wing group, were themselves appointed to the board of this trust, which today owns the land. They don't have any familial or professional connection to the case. There's a question.
Security is only a pretext. It's a pretext to have a presence there. Ariel Sharon, 45 years ago or so, already had an apartment there in the old city. And because he was such a high visibility person, it had to be guarded by the border patrol. He didn't even live there. But because he had an apartment, which was supposed to be a target, there was continuous presence, and it was symbolic rather than real.
And yet it's something that the state does have to worry about. Being there within the neighborhood, and very quickly, you see a very stark difference between the Jewish and the Arab neighborhoods, although not much separates them.
Yeah, sometimes nothing at all. Sometimes you're talking about actual neighbors side by side. Though certainly it's not a friendly atmosphere. When we ask them about how they get along with their neighbors, the spokesperson for Ateret Kohanim says maybe there's a hello when you pass by them on the street, but there's certainly no case of people being invited to each other's homes. And we're talking about one case where a family home was attacked 126 times over 3 months during the context of the current terror wave. So definitely a delicate situation.
Absolutely. Amir, Oren, senior political analyst for Haaretz, and our own senior defense correspondent Shai, I want to thank you both for weighing in this afternoon. We're going to take a short 2-minute break, and we'll be back here with more headlines from around the world. 2 minutes, and we're back. Don't go anywhere.
Level of extremity when you talk about the offenses themselves, the attacks, it's become quite expected, you could say. We've seen an overall reduction in the amount of violence since about March, April, but there have been a number of measures. It's difficult to ascribe them to particularly this tactic or measure. When we spoke to IDF officers, they also admitted they don't actually have any data or numbers, statistics that can actually point to this measure being overall effective. They can point to a few cases where they know that the threat
for this act, and there will be bitterness all around. Had it been left only to the generals and to the coordinator in the territories and the Shin Bet Internal Security Agency, they would have probably voted against it, all in all, with some exceptions. But because politicians are, of course, looking towards public opinion, and they believe that they must do something, sometimes anything, to show that they are not a suicide bomber, a person who decided that his own life was worth sacrificing. When he goes out on a mission, does he really care what happens to his family, to their house? Perhaps some of them do, and perhaps some of these actions are foiled either by the perpetrators themselves, who stop short of acting, or their families turning them in. But in other cases, of course, other people would take revenge.
Israel is clearly ramping up demolitions. According to Haaretz report, 293 homes have been demolished in just 6 weeks this year, compared with 447 for 2015. Shai.
Right. Yeah, that statistic refers also to homes being demolished for illegal building permits and that kind of thing. But when you talk about the homes being demolished in a security context because of terrorist acts, we're still talking about a fairly considerable number, well over a dozen just in the current context of the current terror wave. It's being used, I would say, past a certain of demolition has led to, for example, family members being turned in. But they can also point to cases where it's thought to have inspired later attacks, and it's also known that terror groups usually fund the rebuilding of the homes. So there's a whole debate here, and I wouldn't say that there is any really classic sort of indication that this is effective.
I mean, what's your take?
It's very controversial, even within the defense establishment, for the very reason which I mentioned, because there's a delicate balance when